afternoon and good evening or good morning, depends on where you are, everyone. It's my great pleasure today to welcome a really wonderful guest, Professor Shreepali Patel, who's gonna be doing our final Rebellious Research Seminar appearance for year 2024. With her talk on multimodal storytelling, language, process, and radical interdisciplinarity. So without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass it to you, Shreepali. So the next hour or so is yours.
Okay, thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Really hard giving a presentation like this where you can't see anyone. So, hello. Agatha, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to your Rebellious Research series. I think it's absolutely wonderful. It's great to see the work of everybody else and to see it all coming together through your seminar series. So for me, it's actually been really thought-provoking and really helpful to be able to look back a little bit at the projects that I've been involved in and to frame them in some way that actually will help me as I move on to my next project. In this presentation, I'm looking at multimodal storytelling, language process, and radical interdisciplinarity. I'll be looking at 3 case studies, possibly 4, with which I've been operating in an interdisciplinary way, looking at the development of language and communication between disciplines, and also the development of new processes, and even the amalgamation of several processes to work with different aims, priorities, and outcomes. But in order to give some context to the case studies, I thought it might be useful to give some background to my own research interests and the research organisations I have been and continue to be involved with. So my own personal research interests focus on human-centered design, creative technologies, storytelling, obviously, and underpinning those are themes of culture, heritage, identity, social justice, and health and well-being, which may seem like quite a broad mix, but they do actually all tie in together in some sort of way. And this is usually underpinned by several SDGs. I enjoy working with different formats, digital and analog, platforms of experience and production methods. A few weeks ago, Lee Jane talked about the labour of love, and most of my research projects have been exactly that. I currently lead the Sonic Screen Lab, a research hub based at the Screen School at UAL, University of Arts London. And the hub works across all aspects of filmmaking, sound, music, immersive, XR, animation. We even have journalists and cultural theorists as well attached to the hub. And the hub uses storytelling as a tool for interpretation, understanding, and change, and explores interdisciplinary, creative, speculative, multimodal, and hybrid media and genre formats, as well as creative technologies, which sounds like a mouthful. But I think simply because of working in this kind of interdisciplinary field, I love the fact that we can all kind of party together and play and see what emerges from the space. So Sonic Screen Lab is in its infancy. It's just starting out, and it's got some great colleagues involved. In my previous position, I was director of StoryLab, which is a research institute based at Anglia Ruskin University, where I worked with a variety of colleagues and partners across a range of interdisciplinary projects, many of which were funded by the AHRC, ERC, KTPs, and public and private sector bodies. And some of the case studies I'm talking about today will have emerged from StoryLab. So underpinning both these research organisations, for me personally, is the use of creative tools of production and how they're applied to storytelling. Much of this research is driven by my years as a practitioner in industry, working in television, radio, and theatrical releases. I'm sufficiently older, to have started at the BBC when we were still filming on 16mm, using 1/4 inch alongside beta. But I embraced the introduction of the prosumer cameras such as the PD150. I brought in beach boxes to adapt them. I loved how these small little cameras enabled a new intimate and semi-democratized approach to documentary storytelling. And as technologies develop, I love how they enable new ways of directing, creating, expressing and telling stories, and new ways of working and collaborating and talking to each other. But the frustration is when you've just learned how to work with a piece of machinery, new codecs, plugins, new partners and collaborators, the technology becomes outdated and obsolete at such a rapid pace that it's difficult to lay down an established framework of practice. And that's all, and that all sits under what I call, or what many people call, the fourth industrial revolution, a backdrop of technological development, but also against a backdrop of shifting global political, socioeconomic and technological sands. And I think the two are interrelated. And this shift in technology from and the development of this technology and how we tell stories and the multimodal platforms are significantly, I think, interlinked with the shifting socioeconomic landscape. But like buses, you wait quite a while for an industrial revolution. And just when you thought you were in the middle of one, the fourth one, another one comes hurtling along, really before you can get over the impact of the last one. So arguably, this new fifth industrial revolution has been hastened by innovations, I think many during COVID-19. And it seems to be characterized by a synergy between human and machine intelligence. And I know this is quite a controversial landscape at the moment that we're all trying to navigate. But also, interestingly, it will include, and it does include, the development of a new language for many. This is new territory for me. As I get older, my agility to work with new technologies is very poor, and hence why I like collaborating with many people. But my interest in creative technologies, as I said, span analog, digital, and is now venturing somewhat into the cyber. So it's within this context, we look at 3 case studies and possibly 4: The Golden Window, The Crossing, The Frontline, and If Time, Threads. And these are just 3 of a number of creative practice research projects I've been working on with colleagues. So The Golden Window was the beginning of my research journey many, many years ago. I worked with Dr. Tobin Austin, a neonatal consultant. He used therapeutic hypothermia with babies that experienced traumatic birth, HIE. The newborns were placed in a state of cooling as part of a 72-hour window of recovery. And I'd been interested in the use of hypothermia, but more so in the induced state of stasis that occurs when babies are placed in that cooling environment. So I wanted to find ways of telling a story where it seemed like nothing is happening for almost 3 days, but for the parents, it is a waiting game as they sit in the neonatal intensive care unit, NICU, as they sit within the NICU bubble with agonizing anticipation. So I worked closely with Dr. Tobin Austin and collaborated directly with nurses, doctors, and patients. And HIE and the use of cooling is a complex science. For the project, it was imperative to find a way of blending the science and emotion in a way that would communicate with a wide variety of audiences. As the patient could not speak, we filmed with parents, nurses, and doctors. But visually and sonically, we try to embrace the baby's point of view. So what you see here is Tim Siddell, our cinematographer, who embraced the fact that we had virtually no money to shoot, but we wanted to embrace the Interrotron style of looking straight into the camera way back then. This was shot, I think, about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. So Tim used a clear piece of glass in front of the camera to reflect the image of our interviewee, keeping a direct gaze on me. So the interviewee, in this case, Toppen, was looking directly at me through a piece of glass, and Tim's camera was to the side. This is, see the little triangle, would capture the reflection. And it formed a really interesting way of interviewing and forming a relationship with the interviewee. And some of the interviewees commented that it felt almost womb-like, similar to the incubators that their babies were resting in. And the space and how the interviews were filmed were designed to allow the carers to reflect upon their own thoughts, experience, and emotions away from the tense environment of NICU. So that those kind of parameters, budget forces you into thinking new ways, actually worked in a really strong way in terms of creating a relationship with our interviewees, something I hadn't felt before in the broadcast landscape. In the unit, we used macro lenses and tilt and shift to give that sense of heightened reality with very deliberate slow pans. And in the grade, we also moved out of the real world and gave the whole film slightly creamy, otherworldly feel to represent that bubble that the parents were in. The soundscape was created entirely from diegetic sound, the unit, simulators, ambulances, and was designed to create a world from chaos. The emergence of the baby, birthing, monitors, ambulances, in some way kind of reflecting what the baby might be hearing. And this is all based on, I call it bidirectional knowledge exchange from Toppen, and based on medical evidence. And we were kind of exploring how can you tell a story from the point of view of somebody who can't tell you their story. So it hopefully simulated the infant point of view. We used the slowing heartbeat as the temperature drops, and we created an impressionistic world of suspension. This was later translated to 5.2 surround sound, which could also be experienced through Bluetooth headphones. So there's a lot of text, and you don't need to read through this, but I thought it was quite interesting to have a look at the research questions, and they emerged retrospectively, because I was playing. I wasn't guided by research questions. They kind of emerged from that state of play and actually from critical reflection following the project, and actually co-authoring a paper with Toppen. I realized as a practitioner in industry, most of the project had developed instinctively, but in industry, I had never had the time to review the process. The reflective critical practice led to unexpected insights, and these were fed forward to the next project. And the outputs, we created 3 practice outputs from one project. Having embarked on only producing one, this was a really interesting process. We had so much great material, and I think most of us realized that we can't put everything into a film. And in the commercial environment, this would normally end up on the cutting room floor, and you would have to murder your darlings, basically. But I was able to repurpose some of this material that would normally end up on the floor, which is gold, into a multi-platform experience. So in Cambridge, we have a 13-screen gallery, 13 separate screens that can talk to each other. And we created an extended piece of 45 minutes, which almost reflected that agonizing weight that the parents would feel. Those fragmented narratives were important as they fed forward into the next project. It's also bi-directional knowledge transfer that I talked about earlier. It was interesting working in a health environment separate to working in the hospitals as I had as a broadcaster, because the process was very different. The process of knowledge exchange was very different. The process of trust was very different. And I think it was a deeper engagement, a more experimental engagement as a result. And we also worked with undergraduate researchers and students, and this became norm for the following projects. And you end up developing a different relationship and experience with these students. So key aspects of the Golden Window fed into the next project, which was The Crossing, which is a multi-platform project on human trafficking. Some of the key questions were, can film be an effective tool in raising awareness of techniques used by traffickers? Can multiple platforms of a single narrative suggest an alternative approach to storytelling? Again, a lot of these research questions emerged through critical reflection. The project started life in 2007 when I was approached by a producer, Colin Burrows, in London to document an installation curated by Emma Thompson and Sam Roddick. The installation recorded a journey by a trafficked woman and was based on first-person testimony by a young girl trafficked through the offer of hope and a different life. Emma enrolled the assistance of artists and creators from several disciplines to create an experiential and physically immersive journey, which for the participant would allow them to feel for 5 minutes what it would be like to be trafficked. The result was a series of containers which the audience walked through to experience the individual interpretation of each artist on an element of their journey, of her journey. So various artists were involved, including sound designer Mick Martin, artist Ansh Kapoor, and Sandy Powell. And the exhibition opened in Trafalgar Square, moved to New York, Barcelona, and The Hague, culminating in Vienna as part of the United Nations debate on cross-border trafficking. But the containers were wieldy and expensive to transport and eventually stored, effectively mothballed. And the exhibition itself was predated the arrival of alternate realities. So following on from the Golden Window, I was asked to create a digital iteration of Journey, and this involved Into the Crossing. At this point, the political landscape was fairly toxic, anti-immigrant. We've just had Brexit, and we're about to hit a Trump presidency. And I never thought I'd say these words, the first Trump presidency. And audiences were, and arguably still are, dealing with empathy fatigue. So I had to find another way in to audiences. So I did this by focusing on the black market economy of the trafficking and on the loss of revenue through the black market economy of about 150 billion, which is a conservative estimate. So at the project conceptually, we were looking at creative ways to visualize data and considering a lean-in experience for the audience, feeding forward the insights from the window. And these were namely sonic and visual immersion and the use of narrative fragments for multi-audience experience. We were able to collaborate quite substantially with professional crew who wanted to play and explore out of a commissioned environment. This included the wonderful drone operators, the helicopter girls, and the wonderful cinematographer, Nicola Daly. So back then, drones weren't as ubiquitous as they are now, and we had access to utilize a heavyweight drone with a 5K capacity with an Alexa Mini. So this gave us unparalleled camera and lens control at extended ranges. This allowed us dynamic moves into the air, which gave us the ability to navigate through spaces to give intimate and quite playful shots. And this provided the viewer with an alternate version of reality that only this machine could provide. we were working in a perspective shifting mode, cinematically through sound and visual effects, and embedding data on glass fragments. In terms of play, we could not afford at that time for the visual effects a render farm, so we had to build our own at the university, daisy chaining virtually all the gaming department computers together. And we had 24-hour security to watch for any potential fires or smoke from overheating the computers. Then it took us 2 months on our low-tech resources to render 2 minutes of footage, something which can now be done in half an hour at a fraction of the cost. Again, with those parameters, we were trying to see what we could do, and a lot of that was through dialogue between various creative disciplines, and we were trying to talk each other's language and see what could be done and what couldn't be done. And it was a very interesting, at times quite frustrating process, because there were limits to what we could do in terms of what the technology could allow us to do. So again, our production methods tested sound, visuals, visual effects, and a 13-screen platform of experience. And the fragmented nature of the visual narrative allowed us to distribute the project across several platforms as the technology and user experience evolved through the years. So this included a physical 360, an interactive using Clint, a 360 VR, and interactive VR via Unity, where we embedded eye gaze and data on glass fragments that the audience could reach out to and hold and draw towards them. And that held data. It had various human trafficking data, the financial markets, and so on. And we used Bluetooth headphones to encourage an intimate experience in a mixed environment to deepen the engagement with the immersive sound design. And the Bluetooth headphones were very effective. We were often screening with young people, and those headphones actually isolated them into this space. And because we had quite a perspective shifting soundscape, again, we included breathing. It made it a very embodied experience that each individual could navigate solely, but also within a mixed environment. We collated feedback as part of the process, using Poll Everywhere to trigger stakeholder discussions, the Human Trafficking Foundation, NGOs, charities, and security government bodies, and at other times to evaluate the audience experience of the creative technologies, techniques, and platform of experience. So our outputs were obviously the 6 platforms of experience. We also built an educational toolkit, and our research insights included this concept of a pedagogy of discomfort. Some of our feedback, such as "I'm left deeply thoughtful and disturbed after watching this," appropriate reactions, I would say, said one. The money, the lives, and what feels like almost a normalization of the industry demonstrated that the crossing remained alert to the risks of empathy. Instead, the application of a pedagogy of discomfort has been an effective tool in invoking the position of witness in the audience. It also gave us insight into collective agency. The immersive nature and delivery of film has enabled a collective space for our multiple stakeholder audiences. Global screenings online for the Human Rights Days, anti-slavery, and so on, and even Glastonbury, and more recently in the 16 days of violence against women and girls. The platform agile narrative framework that we started to develop with the Golden Window became a little bit more refined, and enabled what Annette Hill described as the idea of a double mode of engagement to conscious and unconscious level, which was that space of hyper reality that working across these different platforms and the way that we filmed provoked. And also the development of dialogical aesthetics, these conversations with the VFX, the sound designers, and they engaged us as makers, and a collaborative process. And as Kester's underlying belief is that meaning, language, and social subjects are co-constructed through dialogue, creating a site of shared understanding and knowledge exchange. As Eric Knudsen has noted, each discipline involved in interdisciplinary research are undertaking their own creative exploration. In this case, drone operators, cinematographers, sound designers, visual effects, and editing across multiple platforms. Our unexpected outcomes were many and are still happening. This included working with the Home Office and PCC organised crime unit for their training. In fact, I met somebody who'd seen the film about 5 years ago the other day as part of the 16 days, and it's still embedded into the Victim Navigator programme training. And it also fed forward into the development of new projects, new funded projects and partnerships, including with the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust and AHRC KTP to develop an immersive piece, allowing audiences to experience the Antarctica without actually being in that space, the development of something which is now long-term. And also new partnerships with Essex Police in developing immersive VR for knife crime, and counter narratives with the University of Groningen on Europe's refugee crisis. So at the point in 2020, we were preparing to take the crossing to The Hague as part of the Human Rights Conference. And prior to that, the police convention in Essex, when news came of the pandemic breaking in Italy. The police were waiting for COBRA to shut down all activities, including our conference, but it didn't happen until a week after it should have, a week too late for thousands. So in March 2020, healthcare workers saw their lives change dramatically as hospitals were transformed overnight. And this feeds into the third case study, which is the frontline, which I've called a time capsule, because next March will be the 5th anniversary of COVID, and these years seem to have just kind of sped by very quickly, but I think it's had a long-lasting impact on how we engage with the stories from the time. So these healthcare workers, facing a still unfolding crisis and concerned that in the relentless 24-hour news cycle, their stories would soon be forgotten. They started to capture their emotive testimonies, told through photography, music, art, writings, and social media. Obviously, we were on shutdown. I started collating these stories as screenshots. I was fascinated by what was happening. I was concerned that these stories weren't getting out there in the mainstream. And the stories also revealed a remarkable determination, understanding, and hope that despite their world based on science and humanity being thrown into complete turmoil, they were determined to stay resilient. One story that might be familiar to all of you in the UK, caught my attention. And this was Dawn Bilborough. A critical care nurse had just finished a 48-hour shift and had gone into a supermarket to get some food before her next shift started, but the shelves were bare. She recorded her response on a phone and sent it out, and the clip went viral. The next day, supermarkets had reserved the first hour of shopping for frontline staff and the elderly. It was so remarkable that change could happen so quickly. So after Dawn's story, I suggested to the team, working with Megan Horvath and Marcus Hardin, that we create an online platform to make visible these stories that were not getting to the mainstream but surfacing on social media. We seed funded the project with award winnings from the Golden Window and worked in collaboration with Dr. Tobin Austin again. There were concerns over personal protection equipment, PPE, the grief of losing colleagues to the virus, mental health issues and financial difficulties which surfaced through these individual stories as images, videos, words, music and poetry filtered through online on social media and dedicated platforms. So we created this online archive as part of our website, and healthcare workers could submit. There was a whole kind of record of ethics that we went through, and they had the option at any point to withdraw whatever material they'd put up. Building on the initial phase of collecting and archiving these stories, the second phase brought together these stories to contextualize, investigate, and engage with these narratives through film, through a documentary. I thought we need to bring these stories together, and this happened during the second lockdown. We foregrounded how the healthcare workers' personal response to the pandemic through the use of digital technologies, multimedia formats, and the storytelling process to connect and build resilience and recovery. So this is where it could all go wrong, but I think there's a clip here. How do I do this, Agatha?
You stop sharing.
I stop sharing.
And then you open your link, you click on your link, and then you start sharing again.
Oh, okay. I click on the link online.
And before you start playing it, you go back to share in Teams.
Okay, I go back to share in Teams.
And you go to window again, as before. But this time you pick your browser rather than your PowerPoint.
Okay.
And I think it's working. Wonderful.
Okay, wonderful. I'm not sure if I can get back, but we'll try this. So this is the trailer.
I can't tell you how many times I had to say to people, your story matters. Nobody should say goodbye to their loved one on a phone, you know, not being able to hold their hand.
I think there's a lot of lies out there, really, and I wanted to show the public that what was going on in my workplace.
Every house we passed was the same, blank, fearful faces in every window of every house on every street.
And then it happened.
I must have zoned out for about a minute, just waiting to hand over, just zoned out, just staring at these patients going, goodness me, this is really a lot more severe than any of us had physically thought.
There were so many of them, they became just bodies, not people, not someone's loved one, just bodies in beds.
How did people not believe these paramedics and these nurses and these doctors? You know, how did we let this happen with all these people sharing their stories?
Those are thoughts that don't go away. They're buried somewhere every now and again. I'll think about it.
Okay, and I go back. Then it's a window.
Oh, have we just lost our speaker? Okay. All right, I'm sorry, everyone. I think Shreepali just managed to disconnect herself. Hold on, I think she's back. Oh,
I'm here.
yes, here you are. I think we lost you for a second.
Sorry. I go share.
Yeah.
Window.
And your PowerPoint.
Into the slide share.
Yes, something is happening. Wonderful. Yes, I think we have it.
Do you have the full screen?
Yes, actually this time we do. Before it was a bit squashed, but we see it full screen beautifully right now. So we see Creators Media, that's the slide we are on.
Co-creators media, okay. So you've seen I can see you, Agatha, that's the only thing, so.
There's way more people here in the room apart from myself. There's over 20 of us here, so.
No, but you'll see my full screen as opposed to
Yeah.
my PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
Okay.
No, it looks perfect right now. That's the way it.
Okay. So this was a co-created project. It was made with the healthcare practitioners. They're credited as co-creators. The images that you saw were by healthcare practitioners, Glendine, Emily Gillespie, Duncan, Patrick, and Jennifer. And they also, there were others that delivered their paintings, their poetry, and so on. I picked out a few of these images that gave voice to what they were feeling. You know, they were expressing the fact that there were lies out there and nobody was actually having access to the truth itself. This is Nirav. He's an intensivist in Florida. He was seeing the most horrific things. We're looking at a landscape of a lot of people who didn't believe in COVID, and he was actually having to deal with it firsthand. And he talked about how the response to the virus had been hijacked by politicians, and the impact if one person doesn't believe, how that spreads the virus. There was also from Toppen, he talked about the potential for change at this point. You know, it was a great opportunity if the world wants to take it, to rebuild ourselves and to create a new world. And that was during that first pandemic, the second lockdown, what the potential of it actually was. And this is what the healthcare workers were thinking. Jennifer's words actually echo in my head. So these were said 5 years ago. You know, this is our story, but who's going to listen to our story? Will they believe our story? And sometimes they just don't want to hear it. And are they ready to hear that story? And it calls into account when is too soon to tell a story. And which is why I think of this project as a time capsule. And as she says, people could look back on the photos and say, how did the people not believe? These paramedics and these nurses and these doctors, and how did we not back them up stronger? How did we not trust science? And how did we let this happen with all these people sharing their stories? And she ends with in the future, which I think is now, and it could be in another 5 years and another 5 years as a time capsule. If these pictures and stories are seen, maybe they can make change even then. You know, it really struck me, just the drive that was within these people, that were not just having to face what was happening firsthand, but how they were dealing and building up resilience. So this is still ongoing. 5 years on, it hasn't finished, but currently it has, as its output, it has the online archive, which is still accessible, a documentary of 50 minutes, and then we created 8 short clips, stingers, for that kind of short-term hit, really, and a series of affiliated projects. We ended up working with practitioners in the US and the UK, but also affiliated with healthcare practitioners in East Africa. Obviously, it built into things that we developed: co-creation, online engagement, cultural heritage, and some of the unexpected outcomes are, it has been the time capsule. Obviously, the film has been submitted into the COVID inquiry alongside a number of other stories, but again, I think it needs to come back again and again. And these techniques that we developed in terms of co-creation fed into another funded project, an AHRC funded project called Stories in Transition, where we co-created with veterans in transition back into civil life. And the techniques that folded into that space were about editing, making, ethics, and so on. So again, it's just this constant feed forward mechanism that we have from each project. And there are a huge number of projects that has emerged since the golden window. In bringing together these stories into one comprehensive digital format, we aim to produce new conceptual understandings of resilience, physical and emotional transitions during COVID-19, the non-intended consequences of epidemic control, contextual vulnerability, and how the political field or governmental responses may have inadvertently undermined the response goals. And the project also demonstrated the real value of narrative and arts-based interventions and methods, personal storytelling, in building resilience within the healthcare community and identifying the support they needed and still need. And for the 5th anniversary, if anyone's interested in getting in touch with me, I'm looking at putting screenings together to mark the COVID Day of Reflection in 2025 March. So this is my line there. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I've...
Yeah, you're absolutely fine. You still have about 15 minutes or so.
Oh, well, this will be a lot quicker than that. I thought if I had time, I would just quickly introduce you to the start of a new project I'm putting together, which is called Threads. This explores the relationship between the stories of diasporic identity, defiance, and colonial narratives, which are embodied in inherited textiles of saris passed on by mothers to their daughters. So it's a very different project. It's a very personal project, which has started out with something very tangible, which is material. And I, like actually thousands of others across the UK, the US, Canada, wherever we've ended up, South Africa, Sweden, are being handed down these materials from our mothers. But obviously, I mean, look at what I'm wearing. I'm not wearing a sari, you know. So what do we do with these materials? But also, it's quite interesting understanding the narratives that were embedded in this. So personal stories of women who were wearing saris on the front line of union disputes, Grunwick, you know, strikers in saris. You know, personally, you know, the wearing of this garment was a sign of identity, but also resistance. There was so much embedded in the history of the sari that takes us back to the East India Company, takes us back through the changes in power. And it was almost like a thread. Once you start pulling, all these stories were emerging. And this story started from a sari that was handed down, one of many, and it was my mother's wedding sari that had tears in it, and we couldn't find a derji to mend it in India because all the NRIs were coming over. And these are people like me, people from America who come with lots of money and are spending. And so mending old saris doesn't earn them anything. And so it started this journey into the sari. And then it started a journey into how past photographs were taken, what technology was being used, the Super 8 cameras, the Hasselblads, the studios, the street guys. And also, if I could in some way kind of capture that, and through an intergenerational narrative, you know, where they're passing stories down, how could we capture that? This is now being developed further because it now takes its foundation as an investigation of the creative technologies used to capture visual images, preserve and pass on the narratives of these garments through colonial and post-colonial periods. And it's a further exploration of the platforms of experience as we step into the 5th Industrial Revolution and the consideration of new dialogical aesthetics within the framework of human and post-human creative partnerships. So I don't want to say that word, but it is that word. And how do we work with that? And how do we work with the newer technologies that are evolving? How do we marry it with the analog? So that's it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Shreepali. That was just absolutely fascinating. I have to say that it's quite incredible how you keep your eyes open on everything which is going on around in the world, and you find an incredible way to use your creative and artistic experience and skills to digest it in a creative way and then bring back a real genuine impact on back to society. Absolutely incredible. Can I ask you to perhaps stop sharing the screen so we can see you in? Yeah, thank you so much. So what I'm gonna use my privileged position of a chair of this meeting, if that's okay, and I'm gonna ask you first question, if that's okay. We have quite a lot of people in the room, so I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions, but I'm just absolutely fascinated how, the project, as I said, are so diverse, and they range from the ones which look at the society kind of problems we all facing to the very personal ones, like the last one, which I really love. And I absolutely loved how you included in your slides this idea of unexpected outcomes, which is which is, as we all know, happens with all the projects. And also, you've mentioned many times at the beginning how, upon reflection, once you were doing a project and then you started reflecting on it, some unexpected things emerged from this, which I think is what led to your unexpected outcomes. So I'm going to ask you perhaps a difficult question in relation to any projects you work on and you have worked on and will work on it. How do you go about starting your project? So how do you decide, well, that's going to be my idea, and how then you decide, well, I'm going to focus on this and that, and how does it emerge? I understand it's very organic to some degree, but at the same time, it's incredibly rigorous. And because the seminar is about, inspiring people and young researchers about using their creative practices and turning them into research and responding to all these academic criteria we all have to respond to, so rigor, impact, and so on and so forth. And you do it in such an amazing way. I just want to ask if you have any way to kind of, you could talk about a little bit in terms of how other people can learn from someone like you to start their own projects.
Yeah, so the Golden Window, which is the very first project, that was born of the fact that, like many probably here, you've been teaching for a long time, and apologies to any students here, just tired of teaching these guys to make actually not very good films. They're trying their best, but obviously they're on their learning curve, and you're thinking, well, actually, I'm here because I am a practitioner. I need to practice again. So I think in virtually every institution, there's some seed funding. And I literally managed to get £2,000, and which wasn't a bad amount, but it was £2,000. And I had carried with me, so before I returned back into academia, I'd been developing a story on the use of hypothermia, but this was during the war, and it was a very complex film. It was a drama film, and it was very complex. And I thought, well, I saw this headline, Topham doing cooling techniques at Addenbrooke's, a hospital here. So I arranged a meeting with him, and I had filmed many times in hospitals. And I'd worked with a wonderful director, Jeffrey Smith, who'd made The English Surgeon, which had won many awards. And Topham had heard of it. We met, we talked, we had a cup of tea. And I said, I'm really interested in what you're doing in terms of cooling techniques. And we hit it off. And I said, this is what I'm doing. And he said, why don't we try and do something? And I said, can we? And usually it's really hard to get access, but the relationship was already very different because he was really interested in the arts. So we started plotting, and I said, I've only got a little bit amount of money, but I said, what I want to do is spend a week in Niku. And so he facilitated that. Usually when I've been filming, for the BBC or Discovery or whatever, you're in there and you're out there, and it's a very quick relationship. This I could stop, I could observe. So I did all my preconceptual planning, 2 weeks, just me. I had that space and time, and I wasn't, it wasn't a case of if you were in the BBC, it costs money.
Yeah.
And then I went back and I thought, okay, what can I afford? And I worked with a colleague of mine, Tim Siddell, who was teaching cinematography. We had equipment there, and we had undergraduate researchers. There were some terrific students. And I said, would you be interested in working on this project with me? And they said, yeah. So it turned out all I could afford was 3-day shoot, which was 2 days with a camera and a focus puller, and 3 days with the sound recorder. So 3 days in total. So I had to be very tight about what I could make, but also we could not predict when anything was going to happen. So I made it work within that budget, and everyone was on board, because it was play. And that was the start of that particular project. And so if you're starting out, I would say find an idea that you're really interested in. And I was really interested in hyperreality. I was really interested in that space in a different way. And Topham was really interested in, and is still very interested in, consciousness and the birth of consciousness. So we fuse it. So if we talk about radical interdisciplinarity, that's where it sits, and we're now talking about our third project together.
That's so absolutely fascinating, and obviously so many different ways of, again, communicating to so many different audiences, I presume, because obviously you had exhibitions and you traveled, and it's like a perfect piece of work in terms of what research should be, really. I could talk about it for quite a long time, but I think we have lots of questions in the chat already. So I'm just going to read the first one, if that's okay with you. So Alan is saying, thanks for talk, Shreepali. Can I ask to expand on your comment on a cyborg at the beginning of the talk? And just now, very noisy, where I am. Do you have Donna Haraway in mind, or something else? How does it impact on the practice of your work? Sorry, can't use audio because of... Oh, sorry, I'm just reading additional comments. So yeah.
I'm not going to expand on that last piece. So I thought, should I or shouldn't I just open that window a little bit? And so I can't comment on that fifth industrial at the moment, because it's a space that's still quite unknown, and I think that conversation will evolve into something that I don't think will be a scary conversation. I think it's really how you approach what it can do in terms of the storytelling process, as opposed to taking over the storytelling process. I've been really interested in how technologies can work with, as opposed to instead of. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. I'm sorry about being so vague.
Is Alan still here? Alan, are you still here? Yes, you are. Do you want to unmute yourself and perhaps... Oh, you are. Did we answer your question? Did Shreepali answer your question? I don't know if Alan is... Oh, you have a problem with the audio. Yes. I think that the answer is, I think Alan has a problem with his audio. Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Yeah. There's another comment, and I think Carola has a question. Do you mind, Carola, if I just read the question from the chat first? Okay. So Funke says, thanks for the presentation. What were or are the ethical considerations for the use of visual language effects during editing?
The ethical considerations for using visual language effects during editing specifically. Funke, could you expand on that if you can?
All right, thank you. I was just wondering, what were some of the ethical considerations you put in place in using the visual effects while editing? Because I felt that could come with some kind of ethical considerations.
The visual effects. Can you
because you mentioned visual effects during your presentation, and I was wondering how one could respond to that if you're employing that in one's research.
Okay. If you're talking about the crossing, then in terms of ethical considerations, if it's the crossing itself specifically, what we did with that particular project on human trafficking was that we anonymized our main character and we pulled out universal themes. So the data that we embedded in that interactive environment was indicative of data that was emerging from the UN about human trafficking, etc. So we made very sure that we weren't pinpointing one particular person or one particular story, that we were universalizing that space. I'm not sure if I've got the right end of the question that you were asking. If it's about the impact of being within an immersive environment, that's always, it's always about making sure that people are aware of what they're actually stepping into and what they're about to experience, and safeguarding that particular person when they're there. In terms of general ethics, all these projects have gone through an ethics process, an internal academics ethics process, and also anyone that's actually involved in any of these projects is given the opt-out at any point. It isn't 2 or 3 times and that's it. They're given an on opt-out. So for the healthcare professionals, at any point, they were there through the whole editing process. If any of them felt that the film wasn't representing them correctly, or they wanted to be extracted from the film, we would do that, but no one asked us to do that. So I don't know if that answered your question, Funke.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Carola, would you like to go next?
Yeah, and thank you. Fascinating. And I just wanted to carve out something that you touched upon, and something that I come across when supervising PhD candidates quite often, the need to differentiate between the sort of intermodal concepts of intermodality or intermedia practices versus interdisciplinarity, because sometimes they're being used exchangeably, and my feeling is that we need to put more effort into ensuring that these concepts are differentiated sufficiently. So I just wondered if that is something that you come across in your sort of academic practice, and do you do that in your sort of conceptual thinking about these two concepts?
Gosh, I'm not very good in answering these questions right now. So can you give me an example, please?
So, I mean, I'm just thinking of a past PhD candidate where it was very clear that it was working with film, with sounds, with sights, with interaction with participants as such. And the initial sort of temptation is to call that interdisciplinary. And I probably would rather consider it completely intermodal or intermedial, using different kinds of medium, different kinds of channels. But interdisciplinarity as such, to me, has something to do with different methodological practices. And so I do wonder if within the creative arts practices, and I don't come from the film side, I come from the music side and sound side, that we often do, are tempted to bring these concepts very close together, which might create a new practice. But is there, I guess that's the question, is there a need to create space between these two different concepts?
I think so you're operating within sound and music, and I think the space that I operate on is we have a much bigger party. I call it a party, So, normally when you're filming, you are working with sound. You might be working with composers. You might be working with cinematographers. So you're already working across different disciplines that have their own specialist discipline built in. So in the space I'm operating in, I'm not getting as granular as you possibly might be in your space. For me, and my apologies, right? Because I do like to party. I think there's and I do like to play. I've for me personally, and I haven't come across this with any of my PhD students. So I like to party. So therefore, I don't like to get as granular in within specific disciplines, because that will sit within that particular discipline itself. As a director, I work across with the different mediums. So that kind of, I'm working with a historian at the moment. We're co-authoring a paper, and it's a really interesting process because we're working with archaeologists, historians, and they obviously, again, are digging deep into their own discipline. The paper itself is looking at these dialogical aesthetics, these conversations we can have with each other, which call for a mode of communication with each other. Again, I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah, kind of. And I guess it's one of those questions that doesn't have a clear answer, and we just always need to be aware of that and flexible in terms of the needs of a PhD student. This notion that one might have a thesis and it requires a certain approach, but it depends on the questions or the line of inquiry that is being asked to consider that approach. But the terminology just sometimes gets muddled a bit, and I guess that's sort of my sort of question, because I certainly advised candidates in the past to really differentiate between these concepts. But I do realize that certain practices, like film practices, as you say, have more multimodal approaches than potentially traditionally music communities. Potentially, there are many, and we know of practices that encompass much more than just the audio world, but where then these two concepts are probably much more closer together. So it's a very conceptual kind of consideration. But I think you answered it.
Yeah, and just to quickly follow up on that, when I look at multimodality from my perspective, I'm looking at different platforms of experience, different platforms of communication. So film is one mode, but then VR immersive is another mode. Analog book is another mode, and those interdisciplinary conversations are actually within, I would say, operating with somebody, sound, music, cinematography. Those are interdisciplinary, but then the more radical interdisciplinary comes with, when I'm operating or working with people, say in the medical field, or as I said, historians, archaeologists. Those conversations then call for a different language of communication completely, and often we're saying the same thing, but we say it in a different way. And it's finding that common ground.
Nice.
I'm just going to add something to your conversation, because I think it was quite interesting, especially your final response. That I think we're kind of talking about two aspects or two stages of the project. So obviously one thing is the making itself, where you can, if you really wanted to kind of divide it into, well, you're directing, someone else is taking care of sound, someone else is taking care of the image. But then when it comes to the final outputs, which could be they could be presented in many different ways, then you can talk about this different platforms and multimodality in that sense. But I think perhaps in terms of the production, to your point, Shreepali, I completely agree that in our disciplines, it's kind of, you cannot necessarily separate different elements of filmmaking into, well, this is sound and this is, well, you can, but at the end of the day, you need all of them together to make the film happen, if that makes sense. So I kind of, but at the same time, I understand where Carola is coming from, how it, for someone, if we were to go back to in this seminar aims at, so PhD students who hopefully will be watching this afterwards, and maybe are watching here now, that obviously this division is quite useful at the stage of kind of thinking about what elements of, or what kind of categories and definitions they need to think about. So yeah, very nice. Rosamund, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Shreepali. That was such an interesting presentation, and it was so great to see all the different work that you've done and all the different facets to each project. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about, so you mentioned the platform agile narrative framework, and I wondered if you could just talk a bit more about what you're kind of thinking about there? What are the kind of considerations in that framework?
So it's almost montage, So we're going back to how can you throw one narrative across different platforms? How can they be experienced across different platforms? And so with The Window, it was one film which was 22 minutes, and it worked as 22 minutes. But we had all this other material. We found that when we put it on a different platform, on the 13 screens, we could expand it, we could add more material, but we had to expand the soundscape and the sound design. And it was a different, it was another edit, so to speak, because of that, and it extended to 45 minutes. And the experience of walking into that space gave you a different aspect of that storytelling process and experiential. But with The Crossing, the Crossing is 14.5 minutes. And no matter what platform you experience it on, it is 14.5 minutes. So the idea is that the fragments, if you get a chance to see the film, is actually constructed again in montage. And have these different pieces, but what holds it together is the sonic narrative, the audio narrative, which is her story, which plays out in 14.5 minutes. The way we shot it replicated that. So we have this long piece of walking to camera with our main protagonist, which then shatters at a particular point in the story. We couldn't play with moving that space at any point with the visual effects, the way it had to work and the impact of where it worked. But what I did was we shot montage pieces, various pieces, though data pieces, projections, and that one solid piece of narrative is this walk to screen. So then that allowed us to move it across different platforms. You have that sonic audio. And then when we've played, say, on the 13 screener, it bleeds, that narrative, those images, those montage pieces bleed into each other. We were asked, I think, at York to work in their physical 360, which is a double height space, but it's a 4 screener. So then we selected 1, 2, 3, 4 specific screens from that montage rather than the 13 or 16 different pieces of montage and played it out in that space. But that one piece of sonic audio stayed the same, and we used a Bluetooth headphone. Again, in the VR space, we could move those narrative fragments around. In the 360 space, we literally threw. Actually, what we did was we brought it down to a single screener, and we had those narrative fragments on the screen, on that single screen, so that can play out in cinema. And then we threw that into a 360 environment, which creates this wonderful orb feel. But then when we created the interactive piece, we needed these other pieces brought in, these other pieces of fragmented glass, which we could then do, but we didn't have to disturb the narrative at all. So that's I hope that explains what I mean by a platform agile narrative.
Yeah, it does. And I suppose just to follow up, how much is it that you, therefore, when you go to shoot it, you shoot something that you are already thinking about how it could be used in various ways from the beginning, with rather than, because it sounds like from what you're saying that a lot of those different configurations of the narrative, you didn't know that you were going to be doing all of those when you were actually shooting the material. So it was more about having a mode of working that is flexible and can be turned into different narrative forms.
Yeah.
Is that, yeah.
Yeah, it could be a combination of where everything can be pure montage. If you have that sonic narrative. For The Crossing, for example, there was one piece that was absolutely fixed. And that was the main protagonist visually. That had to happen because we had visual effects built in, and so there's a piece she walks to camera, and there's a piece of glass smashing.
Yeah.
right? And it had to happen on that fixed point. Now that actually took us 2 months to find the ideal location to be able to just do that walk and the speed of that walk in order to hit that main point. And when we talk about conversations across disciplines, you know, talking to the visual effects, we had Framestore, as well as, you know, working with colleagues at the school, you know, kind of going, well, where and how can you do this piece? And the measurements that were considered with the cinematographer, that was all very, very specific. But the other fragments, the data, that's more flexible and that's more agile in terms of working around the space. It depends on the story you're trying to tell, and how you want to tell that story, and always keeping in mind the audience. What do you want them to feel? And for me, I needed a complete lock-in. I needed an eye-to-eye lock-in with my audience in order to have that embodied experience. But, you know, again, depending on how you want to tell that story, you may want to manipulate the media, the content in a different way.
Yeah, no, great, thanks.
That's wonderful. Can I ask you a little bit to expand a little bit on your final project, the one you're working on, because it's so different from the previous ones, and I am aware that there might be some things you might not want to share at this stage, or maybe you know, it's still in development, but because it's so different in terms of the topic from the previous projects you talked about, I'm really interested, you know, where you wanting to go with it and what kind of projected outcomes you will and outputs you will want to have from it, if you don't mind sharing at this stage.
Yeah, so this, I suppose, this particular project is very personal. I mean, I've been working in the creative space for decades. I'm not going to say how many decades, but for decades. And I've always been involved in telling other stories, you know. And for me, that it has been a goal. And there's an interest in that space and the need to surface diverse voices and empower different voices. But I suppose I'm a second generation migrant, and there's a point where you start to lose a connection with your heritage. And there's a point where you say, actually, I need to kind of refocus this and bring this in. And I think, you know, that was also heightened during the pandemic, you know, with what we were seeing in terms of changes in the narrative conversation around BLM and so on. But it really became more and more heightened. And then I think personal circumstances had an impact on making this more urgent. And also this kind of whole intergenerational aspect to it became more important as well. So I was trying to find a way in, and I just played. I thought I need to capture these materials that were handed down to me and handed down to our family, really, and find a way of seeing what emerges. So this is my daughter, and we got worked with a photographer I'd worked with before, and we got hold of a Hasselblad, and I was thinking about the large and medium format cameras, the different imagery that gives you from the digital image, and looking at how at old photographs, you know, I think everyone has these. If you've come from a different place, those images feel very different. They look very different, and those images that I had were very studio, beautiful. The lighting was very different. I'm thinking, well, you know, is there a way of going back to using older technology and seeing what emerges from this space? So I'm being quite abstract about this, Agatha, I think because it's still emerging, it's that sense of play and that sense of reflection. We were really quite blown away by what emerged from these images. We played with obviously the frame rate and the shutter speed, and they kind of gave you something translucent and ethereal. And now I'm thinking of how you can embed testimony into the actual materials, how you can play with the material content, how you can also look at sustainability of these textiles, but also connect with the next generation of what's in there, but using old and new technologies as well.
It's really beautiful, and I said it before, perhaps in a different way, but what I really, really absolutely love about your work is the fact that you, even talking about very important and sometimes very sad topics, you manage to have this kind of sense of playfulness, as you said, like you look at so many different aspects of what you're dealing with and how it can be translated into storytelling, how you can communicate with different audiences, and it feels just so fresh and not forced. As you know, as we know, many times when we look at research projects, we have to comply with so many things, especially when you're asking for funding. You have to almost at the very start prove that it's going to be working, and it's sometimes very difficult when you embark on longer project to know exactly what the outcome will be and what kind of impact you will achieve. And what you're managing is to do very, very important and impactful things in a way which feels just really almost organic, like they just happen. And I just wanted to ask you what your secret is in terms of managing to do this.
No, so the projects that I've shown you are very much generated from a personal point of view, and I was going to embed a couple of other projects that were ERC and AHRC funded, and I thought I'm going to run out of time. So there was one which is called Drunk Adventures in 16th Century Brewing, and that is a project which is ERC funded, a Horizon 2020, with Susan Flavin from Trinity Dublin. And that's a very different, very straightforward project, and that's bread and butter, you know. But and another project, Stories in Transition, again, that's bread and butter, you know. These but these are part of bigger funding grants. The KTP, the Knowledge Transfer Partnership with the Antarctic Heritage Trust, again, was a funded project. So it's very much working to a remit with partners, with collaborators on those particular projects. So that becomes the bread and butter of the funding stream. But having said that, you know, with the Drunk project, a very straightforward piece, what was interesting was having that critical reflection on how, and what I was going to pull out was actually the impact it had on the crew on filming something like that, because it was a very sensorial piece of work. And so I think even out of the most straightforward funded projects, you can really pull some really useful insights into the process and actually push that further. And I think push what, you know, something that you're doing, which is push the recognition of filmmaking further within academia itself, and saying, well, this is what we're doing. It's that public engagement. But the other thing I realized was that there's a freedom that comes from having little money, right? And I think I realized that when I was writing my PhD, and the light bulb went on, where I looked at the projects which had been, you know, well-funded broadcast pieces, to the projects that had very, very little funding, and you were given creative freedom. And as such, if they start out as slow burners and you start to pull out the research themes in them, you know, and it takes time, it takes the reading, it takes playing, so it takes capturing some of the material, It's about looking at it and letting it sit for a while. So, you know, these images were taken back in June, July, but they're burning up now, and I'm now starting these conversations with potential partners and potential collaborators and building it up into a larger funding bid. But it was a slow burner in trying to think, well, exactly what is it that I'm looking to do here? So yeah, I think, as I said, I think there's a freedom that comes with having frameworks, and I do actually really like having parameters. I really like that because I think it pushes creativity. For me personally, it makes me behave.
That's really wonderful. Brilliant. I'm aware that we're running out of time very slowly, so I'm just gonna, because I'm aware there's quite a lot of people in the room today, so I'm just gonna ask if there's any final question from the audience before we wrap it up. Is there anyone who would like to ask a question? Yeah, there's lots of really lovely thank you notes and comments in the chat. I don't think there are questions, but yeah. Well, I'm just gonna say massive huge thank you. I hope I'm gonna have lots of opportunities to talk to you outside of this meeting, Shreepali, about your projects, because they're just really incredibly inspiring and just really wonderful. And I think it was a genuinely amazing session to wrap up this year, not academic year, this year, a calendar year of the seminar series, because it was just really optimistic. It just really gave us hope that just really amazing piece of work can happen in a way which I said before feels just really natural and you know, very doable in a way. You make it sound so easy, and I know it's very often, you know, but that's very inspiring, and I just really loved hearing about all those amazing things. And hopefully you can come back at some point in the future to the seminar and just talk about your future projects, the one you're developing now and more. And thank you so much for wonderful insights about you know, how we can think about different elements of this kind of rather complex projects, really, because there's so many different elements, both in terms of the production process and what happens afterwards. So that was incredibly insightful and helpful. So thank you so very much. I just wanted to say how grateful we are. And obviously I will publish this recording later today online for anyone who is not here with us today to be able to catch up with that. So massive thank you.
Thank you, Gus. Thank you very much for the invitation and good stuff you're doing. Yeah. Thanks everyone who came. Hopefully I didn't bore you too much, and have a fantastic, relaxing break.
I was about to say the same. Have a lovely Christmas, and we will resume at the end of January. So it's the last Wednesday. We're back to last Wednesday of Wednesdays of January of the month, starting next month. I think the next person is Dave Paling from our university. So I'll very much look forward to see you then. But once again, massive thank you, and have a lovely break. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.